Hey everybody, welcome back. It's episode 3. I know, I can't believe it either. They said it would never last. 3's technically not lasting, but who cares? This episode is all about bang for your buck. If you spend more money on a wine, are you going to have a better experience? It's a great question, and we're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about the basic reason that some of the wines are better or worse and how that can contribute to price, where the price aspects come from in the winery itself. And then I'm going to do something which I hope you'll enjoy, where I'm going to present the results of looking at tons and tons of wine reviews to say how people are rating wine based on price, to see if I can give you a definite idea that it is worth spending a bit more or that you don't need to spend a fortune to get a good wine. Right, so let's get into it. This episode is subtitled basically, show me the money, because this is what it's all about. Now, the chemicals in wine, they're pretty straightforward. You've got alcohol, you've got water, and then you've got a whole range of things that generate aroma, and they generate mouthfeel and flavor, and they also generate texture, so that you can feel them in your mouth. Now, the density of those chemicals, the amount that you actually find in the wine itself is going to affect your interpretation of it. And some of these chemicals are only formed in certain ways. So alcohol itself, yeah, obviously, yeast turns sugar into alcohol. But if the yeast get too carried away, if they're fermenting too hard, they can produce what we call higher alcohols. And they basically smell like puke, and you don't want those. So in terms of looking after your grapes while they're fermenting, you've actually got to look after a lot of factors to make sure you get the chemicals that you want. So when we look at getting the chemicals that we want, that's going to give us an enjoyable wine. Overall, the flavors and the mouth feel and everything's going to be great and it's going to look good. We've got to think about the grapes, we've got to think about the winemaking, and we've got to think about how we store it. So all of this is going to have a huge impact on the price because there's more than just grapes that goes into wine. Because by the time you get a bottle, there's so much more that's happened to it. You've got the grapes themselves, and you've got to get them off the vine, so you've got to pay for harvesting. You've actually got to grow the grapes. You've got to pay for everything going into that. There's a lot that goes into it. Irrigation, fertilizers, all sorts of things like that. Cost of harvesters. Then you get it into the winery. If it's red wine, okay, you might be adding oak. Oak's expensive. We'll come back to that in another episode. Then you've actually got to work on it. You've got to do all this amazing work to actually turn this, to get this to turn into the kind of wine that you want. Then it's got to go into a bottle. Well, bottles aren't free. You've got to put a cork in it or a closure of some sort. So whether it's a cork, whether it's Stelvin, you've got to put some sort of capsule around it. You've got to put a label on it. And all of this adds up. The sheer overheads, the power, the labor, your water costs, everything's going to go into this. And then finally, we've got margins, where people actually want to make money from selling wine. Now, if you're getting stuff from somebody's granddad, and lucky old you, because that's some of the most interesting and enjoyable wine in the world, then maybe you've just got to give them, another nice bottle in return or something like that. The rest of us run on profit margins, unfortunately, or we certainly used to. So when we actually go into the winemaking behind this, all of these factors are going to be amplified by the fact that we've got margins. And if you really start looking at all the costs that are involved in this, the cost of the grapes, although grapes vary widely in the actual cost per tonne, is starting to become overshadowed by things like your profit margin, your overheads, your shipping and distribution costs, tax. Now, for those who don't know, there is a wine equalisation tax in Australia. Now, we pay 10% GST on almost all processed goods for consumption. But when this was brought in, there was already a 40% tax on wine. And rather than get rid of it, they've added a 29% wine equalisation tax. Which means, as you can see in this diagram, that a lot of the money of every bottle of wine you buy in Australia is actually going back to the government. It's an example of what we call a sin tax, where you pay for doing naughty things. It's like the amount of tax that they charge on cigarettes and stuff like that. A lot more to talk about in that, but we might do that. If I end up doing any after dark versions of this, we might get into some of the more scurrilous facts for that one. We're going to talk about wine tasting in two different parts. The first is that I'm actually going to taste a wine as part of this, And I've got a Punt Road 2019 Chardonnay that I'm going to be trying. So if you actually want to dash off, I mean, you can just pick this up locally. It's depending on where you buy it from, it's $18 to $20. If you want to do that, pause the video, go grab a bottle, come back. But I'm actually going to talk about analyzing all of these different wine reviews that I was able to get my hands on. What happened was that I had to do some work where I was evaluating the wine enthusiasts' reviews and ratings, and there are about 130,000 of them. There's this giant collection of data. And as I started working through it, I realized how interesting it was. So I've done all the work, and I'm just going to present you with interesting information. So first of all, Wine Enthusiast uses an 80 to 100 point scale. The cheapest wine they reviewed was $4. The most expensive wine they reviewed was $3,300. Now here is a graph showing you the distribution of prices in each of the various points levels. And wow, that's kind of squished down the bottom, isn't it? And that's because those really expensive wines, you can just see them up the top, are pushing everything out of proportion. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to scale this using a log scale. Doesn't matter if you don't get that. Here we can see that we've expanded it out. But what you should be able to see is that overall there's a trend. This starts to make us think that maybe spending more money on wine is important. But let's have a good look at this graph, because you see how most of those dots are red? That means almost all of those wines are under $1,000, thank God, I hear you say. Because, let's face it, if you're going to spend $1,000 on something, it's not going to be a bottle of wine that some dodgy guy on the internet's told you about. Unless it is, in which case I have a bridge I may want to sell you. So what I'm actually going to do now is I am going to show you a really big diagram of that same information, but now what I've done is I have taken the mean value. Okay, so for each of the price points, I have looked at all the reviews and I've said, what's the score they've given? What's the average score? Now this diagram, again, we're suffering from compression, but you can see that we've got this nice looking curve. And it starts, and then above a certain point, it just turns to absolute pants. We've got this beautiful clean curve, and did some statistical analysis, and this is in fact what we call a log relationship, which means that it's going to do a shape like this, and we're kind of going to get close to 100 and hit it, but you can kind of see what's going to happen with this. What that means is, as you spend more money on wine up to a certain point, it does actually seem to get rated more highly on average. But there's an upper limit. So let's have a look at a really confusing looking graph. This one I spent ages on. I just went mad with R. This one is wines where we've actually got enough ratings to make it worthwhile. And you can see, and what I've done is I've actually scaled this. So that beautiful straight line is showing you that as you spend more money, you are getting a wine that is increasing its rating, but because of the way this relationship works, you're actually getting less improvement the further up you go. Looking at this graph, you can see that we've got the blue triangles, which show you the maximum rating that's been given, and the red triangles, which show you the minimum rating that's been given. And they're forming this gorgeous shape around this line. It appears that if we spend more money, up to around, and I'm having a look, about $90 to $100, it appears that spending a bit more money is going to get you a wine that is going to be rated more highly. And we're going to use this as a proxy for it's a better wine. I'm going to concentrate on the section which is basically from $50 and down. And there's an important reason for that. The first is that the wines that are scored 90 or above, the so-called excellent wines that we've got on this scaling system, they start around that point. Around that point, you can basically say this wine it's going to be a bit of a standout. It's going to be better than the wines I would normally drink below this. It's not hard and fast. It's not guaranteed. This is the analysis of 130,000 reviews to try and get some sense out of it. But it's a good indication. And so we're going to have a look at some of the wines that sit in that area, and we're going to look at wines that are $14, $20, $25. But all of these wines, important fact to take away, even that $4 one, it got an 80. It was a perfectly acceptable wine. So affordable wine can be good, first thing. Second thing is that spending a bit more, if you know what you're after and you know what you like, may actually give you a wine that's better, but it is quite a noisy relationship. Now, the other thing I want to show you is this really weird pricing diagram. I've produced these beautiful cascades of wine price by the number of times it occurs. And if you have a look, you'll see that those red dots on top seem to stand out. There are literally more of them than there are their immediate neighbours. And they're all wines that their prices end in 5 or 0. Either people pick these wines more for reviewing, or more people are putting these price points in. Now, this is an American reviewing system. All these prices are in US dollars, but having had a look, they seem to be pretty close for Australian dollars. So whether that's a market, just the cost of shipping them, I don't know. But these are all American prices. But did you expect that? The fact that wines ending with 5 or 0, and prices ending with 5 or 0, we're actually going to do this. Let's go back and summarize it. It appears that wine does get better the more you pay for it, but there's an upper limit. And one thing I really want you to take away when you look at that big diagram again is that 88 was the ranking, was the points awarded to that $3,300 wine. Somebody spent nearly $3,500 for a wine that I estimate you should have been able to buy for about 24. So, price by itself is not everything. We'll look at marketing and we will have a look at marketing. I want to be careful. I don't want to cross people in marketing. I'll wake up with, I don't know, like a vine head in my bed or something like that. But it looks like the range that we've been talking about, the range of 20 to 40, even right down 8 to 10, things like that, it looks like there's going to be a lot of interesting wine to taste. And that's where we're going to live. I'm not going to demand that you run off and buy an $80 bottle of wine in order to taste. This one, 18 to 20, depending on where you buy it. So let's actually have a taste of the Yarra Valley Punt Road Chardonnay. Now, while I'm preparing to taste, have a look at this graph that shows you the number of reviews per variety. Now, this is only those varieties that received more than 500 reviews. Look how dominant Pinot is. Look how dominant Chardonnay is. Look how dominant Cabernet Sauvignon is. Pinot and Chardonnay are the classic Burgundian grapes. They're used extensively. And that influence, we have a lot of Chardonnay in Australia, and so we're contributing to that. But look at Shiraz. Shiraz is actually quite small. Syrah is much bigger. Syrah is the French name for Shiraz, and we have done a lot with Shiraz in ways that many other people haven't. One of the most interesting contributions of Australian wine culture has been Australian Shiraz. We'll talk about that in a later episode as well. Let's taste some wine. So this is a Chardonnay. Now, having a look at that, it's quite pale, but it's got pleasing straw colours, nice and bright. There's no evidence of any haze. There are no bits floating in it. Haze can indicate that the wine is not stable, and bits floating in it could be that it hasn't been fined, as in they haven't removed elements of yeast, but it could also be a sign of faultiness, because sometimes things grow in wine. What do we do? Look, swirl, sniff, sip. Lime, a little bit of tropical fruit sitting in there. I'm leaning more towards pawpaw than anything riper than that, but still nice and juicy in the mouth. It's got nice acid. There's a little bit of a butteriness to it, and that's a character you find in Chardonnay when it's been through what's called malolactic fermentation. Long story, it gives it this buttery note from a chemical called diacetyl. That lime is lovely. There's definitely more tropical fruit in the mouth, melony, and it's got a nice grip. These kinds of wine are often treated with oak very gently, and you want to look for complexing factors in them. People do things like wild ferment where they try to get more characteristics in to give this some body. Again, this is sort of in a Burgundian approach. The Yarra Valley makes excellent Pinot and excellent Chardonnay, and there is a way of thinking about those grapes that if you're sort of making Pinot and Chardonnay, then maybe wandering down the Burgundian path is not going to be a bad thing. But that is a lovely wine for $18 members price at Dan's. Definitely getting some pineapple. Well, that's it for me. Next episode, we are going to be talking about if you like this, then will you like that? So if you're a big fan of Shiraz or Cabernet in the Australian style, what else do you want to try? So many varieties, so much choice. I think I'm pretty much done, so I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Salut! Well, thank you very much for watching. Please remember that wine is best enjoyed in moderation. We're all a little stressed right now, but if you think you need help or someone to talk to, maybe put down the wine glass and get in touch with one of these great groups of people who are on the screen right now. Look after yourself, stay well, and I'll see you next time.